Hey guys, it's Dean. Donkey Kong Country 2 is the greatest 2D platformer of all time. Or at least that's what I've heard for over 20 years. I've often found myself flip-flopping whether I agree with the sentiment or not. And going into this video, I wanted to move closer towards a conclusion. But I think before we can move towards a more concrete opinion, we first need to analyze what it means to be the greatest 2D platformer of all time. Objectively speaking, being the greatest anything of all time is something generally hard to quantify. So how does an opinion so extreme become so mainstream? Well, simply put, Donkey Kong Country 2 was basically the last major 2D platformer of the generation of 2D platformers. From the release of Super Mario Bros. A decade earlier, and until Donkey Kong Country 2 came out in 1995, as it was a money-making genre that everyone wanted their hands on. In order to move quicker towards the point, I'll remove all the nuance and assume you already know that Mario and Sonic were the kings of the genre. The late 80s were for Mario, and the early 90s were for Sonic. And just as Sonic's final game released, everyone was able to transition over to Donkey Kong, and the Big Ape would reign supreme for the next 5 years. Right? Well, no. Because the next year, the 3D platformer arrived and effectively killed the 2D platformer until its renaissance in the mid to late 2000s. To be fair, the 2D platformer wasn't really killed, but it was relegated to an afterthought or a handheld genre for a good while. As a result, many people's last real 2D platforming experience, that being the experience why the 2D platformer was still the king, was Donkey Kong Country 2. Especially since Donkey Kong Country 3 released after the Nintendo 64 had already come out. So naturally, over the next 10 to 15 years, people had viewed Donkey Kong Country 2 as the swan song of the genre. The last big hurrah, if you will. So even though it is an exceptional game, it was largely exaggerated as a result, deservedly or otherwise. Which meant that even with a 2D platformer renaissance, the masses still continued to believe this was the greatest 2D platformer, even though games that built off of everything DKC2 did, and other giants of the era did, were probably objectively better games. So right off the bat, when I think of the greatest of all time statements for Donkey Kong Country 2, I don't usually decipher them to mean greatest of all time. Rather, I view these arguments to mean it's the greatest of the classic 2D platforming era. Additionally, I often wonder if DKC2 was also seen as a compromise of that era. Sonic and Mario fans were never going to agree. For every argument for Mario World or Mario 3, Sonic 2 and 3 had a million counter-arguments, and vice versa. Therefore, in an effort to make an entire generation effectively shut up and agree, it seemed like having DKC2 take the mantle was the only logical solution. Again, deservedly or otherwise. But anyway, this is all to say that while I do think Donkey Kong Country 2 is amazing, I think the mainstream opinion that it's the greatest 2D platformer of all time had a lot to do with the discussion at hand. I don't actually remember too much about the release window of Donkey Kong Country 2, titled Diddy's Conquest, by the way. I probably should have mentioned that earlier, but I tend to assume my viewers know this kind of stuff. I don't really remember the hype or the reception. It's not really something I've heard discussed or analyzed over time. It feels like its release was so sudden, and yet somehow literally everyone I knew picked this game up. My experience with this game was interesting. This might be the earliest game I remember my family purchasing. I had to have been about 5 or 6 years old, sitting in the back seat of our station wagon with my two brothers, remembering my dad getting into the car and suddenly reaching his hand to the back with a box in his hand. A new copy of Donkey Kong Country 2. I don't really know how this came about. I assume my older brother had pleaded with my dad to buy it. I didn't know there was even a sequel to the Donkey Kong game available. But I do remember seeing my older brother freak out excitedly, and me and my younger brother joining in when we realized it was Diddy Kong on the cover. It's funny because the reason I have so much nostalgia for that crazy Nintendo 64 kid video is because receiving Donkey Kong Country 2 in the car that day was my personal crazy Nintendo 64 kid moment. It was the only time I was legitimately blindsided by a game, and as a result, thoroughly lost my mind. And it probably helps that the game was phenomenal. You all know my affinity for characters that can fly by now, and Dixie Kong was no different. If I gravitated towards Diddy when playing Donkey Kong Country 1, I almost exclusively used Dixie in the sequel. She's basically Diddy with that extra hover. And it's funny because I never used to think her hair was blonde hair. My dumb 5-year-old self thought it was impossible for a monkey to have blonde hair, and instead it was a magical banana attached to her hat that allowed her to fly. Regardless, Dixie was now my go-to character. It's kind of funny because in a series based around Donkey Kong, I never liked to play with the protagonist. Maybe that was intentional on Rare's part, because it seems like the only reason their games are even called Donkey Kong is because they wanted to appeal to both their Nintendo overlords and the masses alike, while allowing their original characters to be the fan favorites by making them more enjoyable to control. But I think that's enough fumbling around. I've talked about the reputation, I've talked about my early memories. Now it's time to delve deep into Crocodile Isle and talk about Diddy's conquest to save Donkey Kong in Country 2, Diddy's Kong Quest. You know how in the leaps between each Sonic game or the evolution through the Mario games, you can pinpoint the differences and see how each game evolved from the last? Well, that's not really a thing here. I'm not saying there's no improvement at all in this game from its predecessor, but it just feels like more Donkey Kong, and that's not a bad thing at all. The music and aesthetics, while absolutely jaw-dropping for the time, I would describe the exact same way as I described Donkey Kong Country 1. Don't take me glossing over them as a sign of distaste downplaying just how iconic they were, but I don't really think I can add more to the conversation than has already been discussed, especially when it comes to the music, because I'm not an expert when it comes to game music at all, and trying to attempt another generic explanation of why the music is good like I did in the last video would definitely be an insult to the art. By my estimation, there are 3 main changes compared to Donkey Kong Country 1 that are worth discussing. Maybe 5 depending on how detailed you want to get. The first being the obvious one. DK is no longer controllable. Which, come to think of it, isn't all that odd considering in the very first Donkey Kong ever made, he wasn't controllable either. In his place we have Dixie Kong, and along with Diddy, they set out to rescue a kidnapped Donkey Kong from King K. Rool. The second main change would be the setting. Unlike Kong Island, Crocodile Isle isn't as realistic of a location as DKC 1 is, if that's the correct word to use. Even some of the baddies this time around feel more arcadey than the last game, which I think is for the better. It's not so much of a change that it completely alters the experience, but where DKC 1 flourished in a pseudo-realistic atmosphere, DKC 2 throws you in settings that feel like they could have been designed by Hayao Miyazaki. There's still that incredible sense of atmosphere, it just feels more like a dream. The third main change involves the animal buddies, or rather the additional ones. Winky was replaced with Rattly, not sure why, but it is what it is. Rambi, OnGuard, and Squawks all make a return, albeit this time Squawks is actually an animal buddy rather than just a flashlight. Both him and Quawks are controllable during flying sections, with the only difference being Squawks has the ability to spit projectiles at baddies. This time the flashlight role is taken up by Glimmer in the underwater levels. But let's be real, Glimmer and Clapper the Seal are more like parts of a stage rather than baddies. The best animal buddy though has gotta be Squitter the Spider. I love his sections. They're the best ones of the series by far, and allow for an interesting take on exploration and platforming. All in all, the animal buddies feel like they take more of a significant role in this game than they did in the last one, and they're more memorable as a result. Fourth change, vertical platforming, is a lot more common in this game. If memory serves me correct, that wasn't really a thing in the last game. Not that it really changes all that much, but I thought it was worth pointing out. And the final change is related to how full completion is achieved and how bonus stages are much more in your face than in the previous title. For that reason, I'd recommend going for full completion a lot more in this title than I would the last one. And technically, you can't play the whole game if you don't go for full completion, or if you know the cheat to automatically be granted all the collectible coins, which I may or may not have done for this playthrough just for the sake of time. Ah, shut up, Cranky, I don't care about your opinion of me, nor do I feel inadequate losing to these legends on the screen. Aside from these points, I don't think there are any other changes worth highlighting from the previous game. Well, at least off the top of my head. I'm sure there are 1 or 2 major differences that I didn't point out that are slipping my mind at the moment. Anyway, there are about 14 unique level settings throughout this game, which is only like 1 or 2 more than what Donkey Kong Country 1 had. I feel like it's important to stress that because everyone likes to talk about how DKC 2 is this super amazingly unique experience with all these levels being completely different than the previous ones, whereas really, it's more in line to the same type of uniqueness and repetitiveness in the previous game. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that here, just as there was nothing wrong with it in DKC 1. You can kinda see the similarity right away in the first world, Gangplank Gallon. In DKC 1, the majority of World 1 took place in jungle levels, and likewise, most of the jungle levels took place in World 1. Here, it's all about ship deck, ship mast, and ship hold, which are great introductions to the game and throw the pirate theme in your face right off the bat. After all, this game is not only the 3rd best-selling SNES game, but also one of the best-selling pirate games of all time. Yeah, eat your heart out, Assassin's Creed Black Flag. Diddy's Conquest did it 20 years ago. As you move into World 2, Crocodile Cauldron, you're introduced to the lava-themed levels, as well as the mines, which again add a bit of variety to this game. Something I really admire with this game, as well as its predecessor, is that although these themes are repeating themselves quite often, each level tends to contain new types of challenges in order to keep the game feeling fresh. As a result, it creates a fluid experience that continues to find new ways to test your skills, or at the very least require you to adapt a step higher in the difficulty curve in order to continue moving on. And that becomes blatantly obvious when you reach World 3, Creme Quay. While you do get to experience your first swamp theme in this world, you also return to the pirate-themed decks and mask settings. But this time, you're put to the test and required to move through the stages more frantically. I personally feel Creme Quay is when the game shifts from an introduction into an actual adventure. The training wheels are off, and you're now expected to flourish through the stages and master the obstacles thrown in your direction. And then, just for added measure, you get thrown into Bramble Blast. There's been a lot said about the Bramble stages in this game, that being this one and the more iconic and difficult Bramble Scramble. While I have always found them to be frustrating, I appreciate the challenge they provide while testing your reflexes. This might strictly be coming from nostalgia for frustration in the older games, but these stages wouldn't be as memorable as they were if they weren't so frickin' annoying. If World 3 is when the training wheels come off, World 4, Crazy Kremland, well, it's where the game gets crazy. You literally start off in a beehive, make your way over to a roller coaster followed by a Bramble Scramble, back to another roller coaster, then a swamp followed by a beehive again. I don't even think I need to break it down or say something generic about the difficulty curve and the new challenges provided here. Saying the type of levels alone should paint a good enough picture for you. World 5 gives a bit more of an eerie feel and introduces you to a few new challenges that focus more on the mastery of mechanics you learned in previous levels. I personally really enjoy Web Woods, but that's because I'm a huge fan of Squitter. It really gives me vibes of the Cloud power-up from Mario Galaxy. I always like a good platforming challenge that requires you to build your own platforms as you move along. Finally, K. Rool's Keep. If you weren't getting the game overs or using save states by this point, then you're definitely going to start here. These levels make Bramble Scramble look like World 1-1 from Super Mario Bros. And I'm not even going to lie and pretend it's because they gave you some interesting platforming challenges or whatever. A lot of the levels in this world are blatantly unfair and require you play the level and die a few times because of something that was off screen so you can figure out the timing. It's very Sonic-like in that regard. But in this case, it works very well because this is effectively the last world of the game before you get to K. Rool. However, in order to make it to K. Rool, you have to get through Screech's Sprint, which involves encounters with many of the baddies you saw throughout the game, with a few challenges you faced in between. Followed by a flying race against Screech, an angry, reddish parrot that for whatever reason absolutely hates you. Being the last stage leading up to the boss battle, this stage does a very good job of upping the stakes and really challenging you to earn the fight against K. Rool. Now before going to K. Rool's fight, I'd like to give a shout out to the boss battles in this game. They're miles ahead of Donkey Kong Country 1 boss battles, and as a result make them a bit more exciting to face off against. I think the team did a very good job making them feel more unique and less of an afterthought, just like they seemed to be in the previous title. Now, if I'm being completely honest, the final battle against K. Rool isn't all that amazing to me. It definitely fits the bill for iconic 2D boss battles from that era, but I'd argue the boss battles in the first, and heck, even in the third game was better. Honestly, I think the setting of the battle just never really resonated with me. It just isn't quite as memorable or as epic as the other games in the series. But what I did love about it, though, was the ending. Having DK pop out and Shoryuken K. Rool was just so epic. If the game ended here, it'd more than suffice. But in DKC2, there's more incentive to go for full completion. There are 5 stages, plus a second battle against K. Rool that make up what is known as the Lost World. These are some of the best and most challenging levels in the game in my opinion. And obviously my favorite one is Animal Antics, which has to use all the animals in a row to get through the whole level. Followed by a second fight against K. Rool, which albeit is much better than the first fight as far as boss battles go, but given that it's similar enough to the previous fight with a few more interesting challenges thrown in here and there, I still feel like the setting and environment of the battle doesn't really shine as much as the previous games. Honestly though, I have a fundamental issue with the fact that the Lost World is locked behind full completion. When I was a kid, I liked going for full completion in this game, but the older I get, the less I enjoy it. I'm not really sure exactly what it is about these DKC titles, but the way they have you search for hidden areas to fully complete the game just isn't that fun as a challenge as Mario or Sonic for me. It's also possible that the Donkey Kong games in and of themselves are already difficult enough that it's not as enjoyable to explore, but I think it's the way the characters control in general that bugs me when it comes to exploration. Also, it's very time consuming since you're not just looking for random collectibles as much as looking for bonus areas to grab said collectibles. And honestly, I would be so angry and speak so negatively about this game hiding what is basically the last levels and final boss behind such a long and tedious completionist task, if it wasn't for the fact that they literally built in an in-game cheat to get the 75 Creme Coins. It's one of those old school cheats where you have to obscurely move your character around and avoid the bananas. Something that honestly sounds like it was made up on the playground to unlock a character that doesn't exist in the game. So yeah, this is basically my way of completing the game now. I play through all the levels and just cheat to get the Lost World and beat the game. I just don't have the time and patience to fully complete any of the DKC games anymore. To put it quite simply, I love this game. Shocker, I know. I honestly have very little to critique about it. Minor nitpicks here and there, but they really only surface because I'm doing this video. That being said, I set out to determine whether or not DKC2 was the greatest 2D platformer of all time, or at the very least during the classic era. An opinion I've always leaned towards but never really thought about. And well, I can't say that it is. I can't even say that it's better than Donkey Kong Country. I'm not saying that the first one is better, but it's definitely not worse than this one. As I mentioned earlier, in the Mario and Sonic games, every time a new title came out, it felt like a drastic improvement over the previous title. And there were enough changes involved where each game basically controlled differently. That's not really the case in the Donkey Kong series. Asking me if I prefer Donkey Kong Country 2 over Donkey Kong Country is like asking me if I prefer Sonic and Knuckles over Sonic 3. The game feels the exact same, and while the stages differ and certain mechanics and challenges might be better in one game over the other, it's close enough of a tie that those differences are negligible. It's very easy for me to say Super Mario World and Sonic 3 and Knuckles are my favorites of the classic eras, because those games were the peaks of those series. Donkey Kong basically peaked with its first title and carried over the momentum by not really needing to change much past the sequel. I know this is kind of a cop-out, and a lot of you are probably wondering if I'd pick a winner between DKC and DKC2, but I honestly can't. These games are short enough and similar enough where if I'm going to play one, I'm probably just going to play the other one right after it. And as a result, the whole experience will feel like one big playthrough. The question for next week, though, is whether or not Donkey Kong Country 3 can be grouped in with these two games, despite the negative image it's carried for all these years. Once again, I'm trying to become a bit more consistent with my videos so I can work out the whole algorithm situation, but if you'd like to view the sequel early, for the cost of a cup of coffee on my Patreon, you can have early access to the Donkey Kong Country 3 video. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you all in my comment section next week. As always, thanks for watching. Dean, out.